He got involved with the local Harrogate Baptist Church. He seemed very religious. He often talked about God. If somebody's religious, you trust them, you believe in them.
David used to worship here very regularly, most weeks. He used to come, he used to sit right down there in the same pew every week. I found him a very pleasant guy. I'd like to be able to say I had him sussed, but I just didn't. He was open, it seemed to me. He was helpful. He wanted to be supportive to other people. And I thought an all-round good egg.
Elaine and Ron were invited to spend Christmas Day 1992 with David Davis and his daughter, Noelle.
She seemed very much in awe of her father. He was the one that did all the talking generally. I mean, she did come across quite shy, but not overly shy. But she always used to look up to her father for approval.
And he gave the couple a generous gift.
In my Christmas present was a card that was a promise to purchase 2 tickets to Canada if we took them by the end of February. And that would be February 1993. And that was a shock for me because I thought, well, that's only a couple of months. How could we just suddenly up and go to Canada in such a short time? But when Ron read it, he was amazed because it was his dream, really. I said, why do we need to go so quickly? And he explained that you guys want to get on with your life. Canada is where Ron wants to be. It's a golden opportunity. And he sort of sold it. He sold the idea of Canada.
And he had a suggestion about how they could remain directors of his company.
He explained that it would be sensible to have rubber stamps made of our signatures so that when we were in Canada, he could then use these stamps to sign documents or cheques or whatever. And he also explained that it's done all the time in business, so it didn't seem like there was anything wrong in that at the time.
Ron and Elaine set off for Canada and a new life in February 1993. But Elaine didn't settle.
We didn't have a lot of money at all. I couldn't work there. Ron had difficulty at first in getting a job there, and it was hard, and it was the middle of winter, so it was a struggle.
Within 5 months, Elaine was back home to be bridesmaid at her sister's wedding. Davis, now a family friend, was invited. But when he heard that Elaine wouldn't be returning to Canada and to Ron, he wasn't happy.
You know, he sort of said how much he liked Ron and how much he didn't want us to part and how every man deserves a second chance, and he tried his best to get me to go back, but I wouldn't go back.
Only days after the wedding, David Davis was packing up and moving out of Harrogate, and Elaine found herself abruptly cut off.
I didn't have his details, I didn't have his address, all I had was a mobile number for him, and so basically he just left.
What she didn't know was that from that moment on, he started calling himself Ronald Platt, and continued to do so for the next 3 years. Elaine had little contact with him or her ex-boyfriend Ron Platt during that time. She knew that Ron had returned to the UK, but she was completely unaware that Ron's body had been dredged up in July 1996. And when Elaine last spoke to David Davis, 3 months after Ron's body had been found, he didn't mention it.
At the end of the phone call, I just happened to say, "Oh, have you heard from Ron?" And he said he hadn't heard from him since June because he'd gone to France.
It was only when she met the police that Elaine realised that David Davis had been lying to her.
In the conversation with the police, they did mention that they had spoken to Mr. Davis as part of their inquiries, and that unfortunately David said he couldn't help them. So, as a response to that, I said to the police, I said, "How long ago did you speak to Mr. Davis?" And they said, "Weeks ago." And it was that triggered in my mind instantly. I thought, there's something wrong, there's something very wrong.
David Davis, who she had only spoken to a week or so earlier, had failed to mention the fact that Ronald had been trawled up by a fishing boat in Devon.
Elaine suspected that he was involved in Ron's death. So the next time he called, she felt frightened.
I didn't know what to say because I didn't know whether I should make him aware that I knew that Ron had died. So that instantly threw me, and then I thought, well, it's best, it's best to be honest and say. So I did, and then his voice just changed, because up to that point he was upbeat, and he said, oh, I would like to come and see you at work. I thought, if I'm not careful, he's going to be suspicious of me, the fact that I don't want to meet him. So I agreed to meet him for a coffee. He was sort of saying things like how he'd said prayers for Ron on the way up on the train, and how he'd shed tears for Ron because of Ron's death. And it all seemed very shallow to me. I could almost I could see that he was acting.
But she played along with him, and when he left, she rang the police. They knew that if he was travelling home by train, he would arrive at Chelmsford Station.
At that point, we decided that the inquiry was such that we would be arresting this man for murder when we could find him. We sat up at Chelmsford Railway Station in the anticipation of him returning. He didn't come home that night. The following morning, I decided to drive past Little London farmhouse to see if the car had returned or if there were any sign of life.
There was someone at home.
I had sat and watched the house, waiting for reinforcements. Because this man was American, somewhere along the line someone said, well, he might be armed. I'm not quite sure where that had come from, but that decision was made that it would be done, the arrest would be carried out by armed officers, on the principle that we're arresting him for murder and we know nothing of the man.
But their suspect had other plans for the day.
Allied 4, got that.
Whilst I sat there, a taxi pulled into Little London Lane.
The gentleman just came straight out. He sat in the front seat beside me, chatting away quite nicely. Just seemed like a very normal business chat, friendly, nice chap.
I followed the taxi out of Wood and Water towards Danbury and Chelmsford.
We were talking about the big house at the top of the road that was just up from where he was, when I noticed in the mirror that there was a police car coming up at very high speed behind me with his lights flashing. And I actually turned around and said to the gentleman beside me, I wasn't doing anything wrong, was I?
I noticed the armed response vehicle coming up fast behind me. Come past me, and they come past the taxi and pulled across in front of him.
And then the policeman came to the window, pointing a gun at my passenger, telling him to get out of the car.
They called Davis out of the cab and fetched him round to the back, hands onto the boot, searched him. I walked over to them and said, "Good morning, Mr. Davis. Do you remember me?" And he said, "Oh, yes." I said, "Well, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Ron Platt."
He reacted very calmly, quietly, never said a word, did exactly as the policeman told him to do.
He didn't seem angry at all. He put his hands behind his back in a very compliant fashion, and they handcuffed him. There was no emotion displayed at all. He was taken to Chelmsford Police Station, and it was at that point when he was searched as he arrived that in one pocket he was, as far as the documentation was concerned, he was David Davis. In the other pocket, he was Ron Platt.
The police now had proof that he was using Ron Platt's identity, but this wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction for murder. Then, as they dig deeper into Davis's past, they find that they've stumbled across an international criminal on Interpol's most wanted list. Police had arrested David Davis for the murder of his friend Ron Platt. They were convinced Davis was guilty, but needed more evidence to charge him.
At the point of arrest, there was very little evidence that turned out to be used in court that we had at that time. The majority of the evidence was in fact gathered after arrest, and as a result of what we found during searches and further inquiries that we made.
Detective Sergeant Redmond from the Essex Police drove to Davis's house to arrest the woman they thought was his wife.
She didn't appear terribly shocked. She was more concerned with the welfare of the baby and the toddler. And while she was packing the bag for the toddler, the female officer who was with her noticed that it seemed very heavy, picked it up and looked and found a quantity of gold bars and cash. Just what a 3-year-old needs for a night away.
And that was just the beginning.
Time is 5:20 p.m, approximately on the 31st of October 1996, a Thursday, and I'm about to film Little London Farmhouse in Woodham Walter in Essex.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
They found £25,000 in cash,
16.
Swiss francs.
8,000 Swiss francs, 17 gold bars, and paintings valued at £6,000.
At that stage we still weren't sure who we were dealing with. So documents were taken, paintings were taken, valuables were taken. Virtually the house was emptied.
The couple were taken to Devon for questioning.
He was very calm and very helpful prior to the actual official interview, and after the official interview he was eager to help, and his whole attitude was that of, you know, I'm going to help you. I haven't done anything wrong to this man, you know. This is a tragic incident.
But when the tape was switched on, all cooperation stopped.
Whilst being interviewed, he sat there and declined very politely to answer any of the questions that were put to him. We got absolutely no information from him whatsoever. So it was nose to the grindstone, and let's try and prove a connection between the death of Mr. Platt and Mr. Davis, who we had in custody.
The house search had uncovered photos of Davis's yacht, the Lady Jane, with him on board. But they couldn't find where it was moored. Then, as Essex police were going through other evidence they'd collected, there was another astonishing breakthrough.
We'd made various notes on the big board, and one of the notes was the Lady Jane. Now, the inspector in charge of the search team came into the room to be briefed and said, "Oh, what's that?" "Well, that's the name of the boat." He said, "Oh, that's down at Mayland. I'm a sailor, and I've seen that down at Mayland in dry dock." And sure enough, that's where it was. And it was transported, complete by road, to the Forensic Science Service.
They found traces of Ron Platt's blood and hair on a cushion in the cabin, and an empty carrier bag from a shop called Sport Nautique.
A fingerprint examination was done on that. Unfortunately for us, Mr. Platt's fingerprints were found on that carrier bag.
An anchor had been bought from the shop shortly before Ron's death. The receipt was found during the house search.
We interviewed the staff at the shop, who were able to tell us that it was 2 gentlemen that had come in that day and purchased the items.
But the anchor they'd bought wasn't suitable for the Lady Jane, and she already had one. It was, though, identical to the anchor trawled up with Ron Platt's body. And when the pathologist saw it, he realised its significance.
The match of the anchor with the 2 injuries on the dead man's leg was perfect. One look at the photograph, you can say, right, this must have been in that position when this man was dumped into sea.
The pathologist had also noticed that the leather belt that Ron Platt was wearing had a pronounced kink in it. And when it was examined, they found deposits of zinc, which matched the coating of the anchor.
I think he was hit over the head, rendering him unconscious, and then the anchor was attached to his belt, and then Davis threw Ronald Platt over the side of the boat. And Ronald Platt ended up on the bottom of the sea.
The evidence against David Davis was building, but still wasn't enough to convict him of murder. Thinking he was American, they sent his fingerprints to Interpol. It was a turning point in the investigation.
Within a few hours, a huge piece of news came through to say, in fact, that the man we had in custody wasn't David Davis at all, and in fact his name was Albert Johnson Walker. He was a fugitive from